Recently came across this new program whose sole goal is to help the final generation solve climate change. Now, while that's all fine and dandy to want to help people be more environmentally friendly, this program differs greatly from most. It's called the 3% Project, and they're systematically making their way through our Canadian schools to indoctrinate our kids with severely biased and untrue propaganda. Now, all of their info can be found at 3percentproject.com, and I felt the need to go through their handbook with a fine-tooth comb, particularly because their target is my own children, and I'm the type of mom who takes a very serious interest in my children's education. 3% Project is led by a 25-year-old climate activist named Steve Lee. He's a policy advocate for the United Nations and the founding executive director for Environment Canada Youth. Lee is a self-proclaimed voice for the voiceless and has been personally trained by Al Gore, and this is important to note because Gore's work has been heavily disputed and debunked by the scientific community. Remember, this is the guy who said the world would end in 2016 due to climate change. Project also has some pretty serious backers, and a lot of the names you'll recognize for being incredibly hostile to Canadian energy and are funded by American campaigns whose goal is to landlock Alberta oil. One partner in particular really caught my attention. Our own federal government is very much a player in this mass indoctrination scheme. Yes, Service Canada is a major partner of the 3% Project. What is 3%'s main goal? Well, it's to get into 600 Canadian schools in 4 waves in what they're calling a holistic approach to educate our kids on climate change. Why are they targeting our kids? Well, I'll quote, "Public education is a prerequisite to achieve ambitious climate policies without getting voted out of office." And I'll quote again, "Public education for youth influences their parents and is the best weapon against disinformation by the fossil fuel industry." What I gather from this is they want to use our kids to get to us, their parents, to buy into the UN's climate propaganda and keep hostile energy development politicians in power. Their plan, which is laid out nice and neatly in their guidebook, is to first find a few youth leaders in various schools who they then invite into their 3% coalition. The students then convince more students to jump on the 3% bandwagon, and then 3% sees the opportunity to contact the school. They're not going to the school boards, the schools, or even the teachers. They're using these kids to get them in like an environmental war battering ram, and they call this their bottom-up approach. 3% then starts their top-down approach to get endorsements and support from the school boards. See, they're using our kids to infiltrate the education system. They give the illusion that they've gathered enough student support to pretend that there's this high demand for the 3% Project to come into our schools. Once 3% gets the go-ahead to have an assembly, those initial students they've recruited get to work hand in hand with 3% to present their views on climate change, which are so biased and full of misinformation, I was floored. Off, they claim that Canada has one of the most environmentally destructive populations per capita on Earth and that we emit more CO2 per capita than the global average. I did a little digging of my own to see where we sit in terms of CO2 emissions. Now, as of October, we emitted less than Saudi Arabia, Australia, and the United States. When I looked up global greenhouse gas emissions, I wasn't surprised that China came in first with 27.51% of the world's total GHG emissions. Can you guess what Canada's percentage was? 1.63%. So to say that we are the worst polluters on the planet is completely false. Then go into their hate on the fossil fuel industry propaganda, which claims that the oil and gas industry will lead to an apocalyptic future we'll inherit. Once again, this is a ploy we've seen the environmental activists use time and time again. Total and utter fear-mongering. 3% Project also uses another tactic we've seen environment activists employ. They use First Nations people to further their cause, but they only look at a small piece of the puzzle and fail to look at First Nations communities who've used fossil fuel industries to create opportunities, lift themselves out of poverty, and heavily invest in the industry. Did the 3% Project talk to Fort McKay Chief Jim Boucher, or the Eagle Spirit Energy Corridor Chiefs Council, or the Indian Resource Council? Clearly, they have not. Shutting down Canadian energy will have zero impact on reducing global emissions. If anything, it will make things worse, considering a gap in the oil market will be filled by countries like Saudi Arabia and the United States. Remember, the 3% Project is also heavily funded by American groups who want to landlock Alberta energy, and this reeks of a new ploy using our children to do just that. The 3% Project doesn't just target our energy sector, they go after our farmers as well, encouraging youth to eat less meat and pressure us parents to do the same. At the assembly, the 3% Project also uses language designed specifically to terrify our kids, using words like impending apocalypse and that climate change will wipe out families and kill everyone. If I was a kid at a school assembly hearing someone tell me this, I'd have a panic attack and be completely terrified. But that's exactly what the 3% Project wants. They want to scare our kids into submission. Once again, this is not based on facts. The International Disaster Database marked that the risk of dying from climate change has decreased by 98.9% in the last 7 decades. After our kids have spent an hour or so being completely terrified with the 3% Project's bogus propaganda, they're then encouraged to become good little activists and spread this message to younger kids in elementary schools, community centers, our seniors, their own families, and even our churches, with the promise of being featured in local media. Is the 3% Project going to equal amounts of schools province by province? No, their main focus is Ontario with 142 schools and Alberta with 126 schools. And can you guess how many schools in Quebec they're visiting? 40. They don't list which schools they're going to be targeting, so I tried to contact someone at 3% Project directly and I got no reply. But you can be sure if they do plan to visit my kids' school, my kids will be missing that day. 3% Project is not about empowering our youth. They're about indoctrinating Canadian kids on a mass scale, and that doesn't sit well with me. Wouldn't have as big of an issue with this if they presented the truth to our kids, but the truth seems so far out of the 3% Project's grasp that they themselves can see no wrong in any of this. It is wrong. It is wrong to lie to our children. It's wrong to scare them unnecessarily, and it's wrong that the Government of Canada is a major supporter of the 3% Project. Get in contact with your kids' schools, talk to your MLAs and MPs, and let them know that we will not sit idly by while groups like the 3% Project have a free pass to indoctrinate our kids like this. I, for one, will not accept this in my local school, and it's time the 3% Project got a good dose of reality and truth. And the truth is that parents will not sit back and let our children be indoctrinated by this garbage.